The July sun blazed over Madrid's Alcazar in the summer of 1599, turning its stone walls into ovens. Inside, Infanta Isabel Clara Eugenia stood at the window of her chambers, her fan moving rhythmically though without relief. Outside, townspeople stumbled through the dust-heavy heat in search of shade. Inside her mind, Isabel wandered deeper into a different heat, one born of duty, disappointment, and decades of dynastic silence. At 33, the daughter of the mighty Philip II of Spain was still unmarried, an anomaly for a royal woman whose hand had once been courted by Europe's most powerful men. She had seen grand proposals rise and collapse like brittle glass. King Henry III of France, Emperor Rudolph II, and even the English Prince of Wales had once been whispered as prospects. But the marriages had never come, always broken by politics, faith, or the iron will of her father. Unlike most royal women, she hadn't merely waited. Isabel had been a political confidant, a near-constant companion to her father in his later years. Her education was second only to the men of court. She had read Tacitus in Latin and debated Augustine with theologians. Her mind, like her soul, was steeped in Spain's imperial purpose. But now, the purpose felt vague. She was no longer needed in Madrid. She was unmarried. And worst of all, perhaps, she was aging. A knock at the chamber door interrupted her thoughts. A lady-in-waiting entered with a low curtsy. "Your Highness, His Majesty the King requests your presence in the council chamber." Isabel inclined her head with courtly grace. Her younger brother, Philip III, had inherited the throne only a year earlier. He rarely summoned her, especially not for state matters. Her heart stirred. Something was changing. In the vaulted stone chamber, she found her brother flanked by the Duke of Lerma, his powerful chief minister and puppet master of the realm. Both men wore unreadable smiles, but their eyes betrayed satisfaction. "Sister," Philip began, his tone overly cheerful, "at last, favorable news regarding your marriage. Our cousin, Archduke Albert of Austria, has accepted our proposal." Her face remained poised, but her heart faltered. Archduke Albert, son of Emperor Maximilian II, was a man of stern repute, pious, reserved, and 14 years her senior. She had met him before, fleetingly. He was competent, loyal to Rome, and thoroughly Habsburg. In other words, a safe choice. But that wasn't what surprised her. "As part of the agreement," Philip continued, "you will jointly govern the Spanish Netherlands with your husband as sovereign rulers. Independent in name, though under the crown in loyalty." The Duke of Lerma nodded, his smile widening. "For Spain, it is a diplomatic victory. The war in Flanders has drained our coffers for decades. Your presence there can bring stability, without further bleeding the treasury." Isabel said nothing at first. The Spanish Netherlands were not rife with Protestant rebellion in the north and resentment in the Catholic south. It was a land groaning under the weight of foreign rule and endless conflict. This wasn't just a marriage, it was an exile disguised as an honor. Still, she bowed her head. "It is an honor to serve the crown in this way, Your Majesty," she replied. She masked her inner conflict as she always had, beneath the polished armor of dynastic duty. Even in her most private moments, she allowed herself only brief rebellions of the heart. She had once dreamed of love, of a union born not from treaties but from mutual respect, but those were long buried. 3 months later, in the cold light of a November morning, Isabel Clara Eugenia wed Archduke Albert in Valencia Cathedral. The ceremony was one of glittering solemnity. Pope Clement VIII himself had blessed the union, making it a sacred bond and a grand reshuffling of power. This was not just a marriage, it was a treaty sealed in lace and incense. When spring returned, the couple set out for Brussels. The journey was arduous. They passed through lands fractured by faith and war, Catholic strongholds choked by taxes, and Protestant towns brimming with silent defiance. To Isabel, raised in the rigid austerity of the Escorial court, these lands felt like another world. "The Flemish are strange people, Highness," whispered Doña Ana de Mendoza, one of her Spanish ladies. "They drink beer instead of wine, bathe more often than they pray, and speak with such cheer." "Every land has its customs, Doña Ana," Isabel replied without looking away from the window. "They will soon be our subjects. We must understand them if we are to govern them." She was already learning, not the language of the people, but the landscape of power. This place was less rigid, less orderly. It was humid and green and unpredictable. Its people, used to canals and commerce, would not yield easily to royal decrees. This was not Madrid, and she was not her father. When they arrived in Brussels, the city erupted with forced joy. Triumphal arches, choirs, dances, fireworks that sparkled over a skyline bruised by conflict. Beneath it all, Isabel sensed a current of tension, thick and unspoken. She recognized it for what it was, a people who had not forgotten war, and who had not chosen their new rulers. The council chamber in Brussels was modest compared to Madrid's, but the mood was heavier. The archdukes, as they were now called, faced immediate crises, an empty treasury, a crumbling army, and a society fraying from within. "We must seek peace with the United Provinces," Albert suggested, scanning reports. "Spain cannot continue to bleed. Stability is our only path forward." Isabel, always her father's daughter, was measured in response. "Peace must be honorable," she said, "but while we negotiate, we must also fortify." She glanced at the map, its rivers, its trade routes, its lifeblood. "I propose a review of taxes and regulations on water commerce." There were murmurs. Water in the Low Countries was more than utility. It was identity. Rivers and canals were arteries of trade, culture, and survival. "Highness," cautioned Count Mansfeld, an aging Flemish advisor, "water is near sacred here. Restriction would bring unrest." "I do not speak of restriction," Isabel replied calmly. "I speak of regulation. Water is life. Whoever controls it controls the land." No one could know then how prophetic her words would become. The spring of 1600 brought neither peace nor prosperity to the Spanish Netherlands. Brussels glimmered with the remnants of the Archduke's arrival festivities, but behind the ornate facades lay grim realities. The coffers were barren. The war with the Dutch raged on, a slow bleed that drained morale and gold alike. And the Flemish cities, proud and weary, bristled under foreign banners. Isabel Clara Eugenia wasted no time. Gone was the ceremonious Infanta. In her place stood a ruler of unnerving resolve. At their first council meeting, her husband, Archduke Albert, had urged conciliation. But Isabel read the room and the kingdom differently. "Honor must come before peace," she declared, her voice cutting through the chamber like a blade, "and survival before sentiment." She called for audits of tax records, especially those involving waterways. The Low Countries were laced with rivers and canals, each one a pulsing vein in the body of trade. Controlling them, Isabel reasoned, was not merely administration, it was dominion. Under her direction, the government introduced a new licensing system for water use. Mill owners were required to pay tolls. Canal routes once free to traders were taxed. River ports came under regulation. A fleet of inspectors, mostly Spanish loyalists, was dispatched to monitor compliance. The policies worked, at first. Revenues rose, trade became traceable. Even some of the local nobility, long suspicious of the archdukes, admired Isabel's iron discipline. But admiration was not affection, and beneath the quiet compliance festered resentment. In taverns and guild halls, whispers began to circulate. "The Spaniards have taxed the rain." Satirical pamphlets, often printed in hidden presses, depicted Isabel as a ghoulish specter draining the rivers dry. She ignored them. She had been raised in the shadow of her father, Philip II, the man who lost the Armada but never yielded an inch of authority. To Isabel, unpopularity was proof of resolve. Meanwhile, the war dragged on. Cities were lost, then retaken. The Genoese commander Ambrogio Spinola, a hired sword of exceptional cunning, brought victories to the Spanish banner. Yet every advance was matched by a Dutch counterstroke, each more vicious than the last. England and France funneled quiet support to the rebels, ensuring the flame of revolt never died. By 1604, a rare glimmer of hope emerged. England, weary of prolonged conflict and distracted by internal strife, agreed to a peace treaty with Spain. It was a narrow channel of possibility, one Isabel was eager to widen. Her correspondence with Elizabeth I's court, polite but pointed, had helped smooth the way. Even in war, Isabel remained a diplomat. But just as peace seemed within reach, nature turned against her. In 1605, an unusual drought gripped the Netherlands. Rivers thinned, Canals became sluggish. Farmers struggled to irrigate their crops. Breweries, cornerstones of Flemish culture, faced closure as water prices spiked under the toll regime. In the city of Ghent, tensions exploded. Brewers rioted, attacking tax collectors and overturning wagons marked with the crown seal. Spanish troops responded with brutal precision. The uprising was crushed in 2 days. Dozens were killed. Hundreds were jailed. But the damage had already spread far beyond the city walls. The rebellion had awakened old memories of Spanish cruelty, of Alva's terror, of the 80 Years' War's earliest days. To many, Isabel was no longer an administrator. She was an occupier. Rather than retreat, she advanced, pressured by military advisors, and perhaps by her own growing sense of siege. Isabel issued the Edict of June 1606, an absolute decree transferring all water rights to the state. From that moment forward, rivers, canals, wells, and rainwater collection fell under direct government authority. Private usage without a license was prohibited. The people called it what it was, a ban on water. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. Bruges erupted. Antwerp followed. In Mechelen, a priest was arrested for preaching that God's gifts should not be taxed. In Leuven, university students staged theatrical performances, mocking the Archduchess, dressing as fish gasping on dry land. But if Isabel was wounded by the mockery, she showed none of it. Authority must be preserved at any cost, she told Albert in a late-night conversation. My father always said it is better to be feared than loved, if one cannot be both. Albert, gentler by nature and increasingly uncomfortable with his wife's severity, attempted quiet reforms. He softened enforcement in some rural areas. He allowed local magistrates more discretion, but power was slipping into Isabel's hands alone. Her letters to Madrid made clear. She considered the water ban not just a policy, but a doctrine. In Brussels, at court, her presence became both revered and dreaded. She walked the halls in dark silks, her posture rigid, her gaze steady. Courtiers lowered their eyes when she passed. The Flemish nobility, once skeptical, now respected her, but with the wary admiration one reserves for a well-fed hawk. She had achieved what few thought possible, control in a land historically allergic to it. Yet the price had not fully revealed itself. Not yet. As the drought deepened, and unrest smoldered like a fire beneath damp straw, Isabel believed she had turned the tide. She mistook silence for stability. But something was already stirring, not in politics, but within her own body. A small itch, a rash perhaps. Nothing serious, not yet. It began with a rash, a small patch of red on Isabel Clara Eugenia's forearm. At first she paid it no mind. The summer of 1606 had been harsh, and the damp climate of the Low Countries often triggered minor skin irritations among the court. Her physicians, summoned with characteristic discretion, diagnosed it as a passing inflammation, perhaps caused by the wool of her gowns or the thick brocade gloves she wore on ceremonial visits. They prescribed mercury ointment, the standard treatment of the age. A small dose, they said, applied gently, nothing to worry about. But within days, the rash spread. First to her other arm, then to her neck. Tiny pustules bloomed like blisters of betrayal. They itched, burned, and resisted healing. She kept applying the ointments, unaware that each application added poison to her bloodstream. In public, she remained composed. The illness, she insisted, was a mere inconvenience. Her Spanish ladies-in-waiting knew better. They noticed how she avoided light, how she walked slower, how her once ivory complexion now showed blotches beneath carefully applied powder. Mirrors were veiled, doors were kept closed, the palace grew hushed. Outside her chambers, the effects of her water edict were becoming impossible to ignore. The drought had not lifted. Wells dried, crops wilted, disease began to slither through the cities like smoke through cracks. Hygiene suffered as public fountains were shuttered or taxed into disuse. Water, once taken for granted, became a symbol of oppression. Merchants muttered that the very air in Flanders had turned against them. Albert, increasingly disturbed by both the unrest and his wife's condition, resumed secret peace talks with the Dutch rebels. His advisors urged caution. The 12 years' truce was on the table and time was against them. Isabel, locked away in her rooms, still clung to her vision of absolute control. When she learned of the negotiations, her fury erupted. "You have betrayed our authority," she spat, her voice hoarse with both illness and rage. "No peace is better than a dishonorable one. We do not barter with rebels." Albert met her gaze. He had never spoken to her with such bluntness before. "The true betrayal," he replied evenly, "is letting our pride destroy what we still hold. Water flows, Isabel. It cannot be held back by decree." It was the first time she flinched, not physically, but emotionally. For a moment her iron mask cracked, but then she turned away. They do not deserve peace. Within Brussels, the rumors grew darker. Some whispered that the Archduchess was cursed, that God himself had struck her for hoarding his most sacred gift. Others, more daring, speculated about a punishment worse than disease: maggots, worms beneath the skin, a rot that festered from the inside out. By early autumn, her condition could no longer be hidden. The pustules had become lesions, swollen, weeping, hot to the touch. Bandages soaked through in hours. Her attendants changed them in silence, never meeting her eyes. The stench became impossible to mask, even with clouds of ambergris and incense. Her chambers were sealed, ostensibly for privacy, but also to contain the scent. Only one woman remained by her side without fail: Doña Sancha de To, her lady-in-waiting since childhood in Madrid. Each morning, Sancha entered with fresh linens, herbal compresses, and prayers. "Highness," she said softly one day, as she applied ointment to the lesions, "the Flemish doctors insist they can help. Dr. Van Helmont has experience with ailments of the skin. He's cured many." Isabel shook her head, her voice brittle. "No Flemish doctor will touch me. They have already brought enough misfortune with their soft words and treasonous advice." Her illness had become indistinguishable from her politics. To Isabel, every act of healing now came with ideological weight. If she accepted Flemish medicine, did it mean accepting Flemish values? Her body and her sovereignty had become fused, each a battleground, each in decay. By the new year of 1607, even her attendants began to whisper. Something moved beneath the skin. One day, as Sancha peeled away the bandages, she froze. Tiny shapes, pale, wriggling, emerged from the sores. Larvae, living things. Isabel saw them too. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She simply stared into the mirror, her face now swollen and red, and whispered, "Am I being eaten alive?" Outside, the political world teetered. Albert, desperate, accelerated the truce negotiations. He signed letters in secret, met with Dutch envoys under cover of night. Isabel, half mad with fever, barely noticed, until one day he told her the terms. "The Dutch will recognize our sovereignty in the south if we recognize theirs in the north." She glared at him, swathed in blankets despite the choking heat. "You call surrender reasonable? My father would turn in his grave." Albert did not flinch. "Your father also knew when to yield, Isabel. We must reconsider the water regulations. People are dying." At the word water, she erupted. She sat up, trembling, the blankets falling away to reveal her bandaged arms, oozing a sickly yellow. "Never. Water is the key to this land. Without it, they are nothing. Control of water is control of rebellion." Her coughing fit interrupted her tirade, and when it ended, something fell from her lips. A worm, pale, alive. Albert stepped back in horror. That night, he summoned a secret council. Among them was Jan Baptist van Helmont, a physician known for his groundbreaking work in chemistry and medicine. After hearing the symptoms, Van Helmont gave his diagnosis. "Miosis," he said gravely, "a parasitic infestation." "And the mercury treatment must be stopped," Albert finished, pale. "Yes, it's poisoning her further. The body cannot heal under such conditions. And the irony," Van Helmont added, "is unbearable. Water is the simplest prevention. Frequent washing, clean surroundings. Without it—" He trailed off. Albert said nothing for a long time, then he nodded. "The morning will bring doctors," he said, "and water." The next morning, for the first time in months, water was brought into the Archduchess's chambers. Basins of it, infused with rosemary, thyme, and lavender, steamed in the corners like silent witnesses. Van Helmont stood near the door, flanked by 2 assistants and guarded by the tense presence of Doña Sancha. The Empress sat in her chair, pale and trembling. Her eyes narrowed when she saw the Flemish doctor. "Out," she rasped. "I will not be touched by these charlatans." But Albert stepped forward, not as husband but as sovereign. "This is no longer a matter of preference, Isabel," he said, for once using her name without title. "It is life or death. You are gravely ill, and you will accept treatment." A silence settled between them. All the years of their marriage, of loyalty, of distance, of strategy and ceremony, suspended in a single, agonizing moment. After a long pause, she relented, but only on her terms. "Then let them examine me," she said coldly. "In the presence of my Spanish ladies, I will not be stripped like a common peasant." Van Helmont bowed. "As you wish, Highness, but understand, what we do now is no longer medicine. It is rescue." The process began that very afternoon. Isabel was undressed slowly, her body a landscape of lesions, rot, and bandaged decay. The physicians recoiled only slightly, enough to be seen but not enough to provoke panic. Beneath her skin, the larvae had multiplied, burrowing deep into muscle and tissue. The doctor's voice remained calm as he delivered the truth. "Highness, your illness is the result of a severe parasitic infestation. These creatures feed on living flesh. The mercury has worsened it. Your skin no longer protects, it welcomes." At the word water, she winced. "You would bathe me like a fishwife," she muttered bitterly. "Not only bathe you," Van Helmont replied. "You must drink water, clean water, to flush the mercury from your blood. It is the only way." She turned to Albert, searching for defiance, but he gave her none. "It will be done," he said. And just like that, the foundation of her world cracked. The woman who once ruled rivers with parchments and edicts now submitted to the very force she tried to control. Her surrender was not loud. It was quiet, dignified, but devastating. Over the following days, her chambers became a sanctuary of agony. Each bath was a trial, as attendants wept in silence. Still, Isabel endured. She clenched her jaw and stared ahead, never screaming, except once when they scraped a cluster of larvae from her collarbone and uncovered a pocket of living rot beneath. Her body was losing the fight. Years of mercury use had damaged her internal organs. She had eaten little in months. Even the freshest water, laced with lemon and vinegar, brought waves of nausea. Still, she persisted. When she was lucid, she asked for news. When she burned with fever, she recited Latin psalms and hoarse fragments. Her world was dissolving, but she refused to vanish with it. Outside, Albert moved quickly. He finalized the truce with the Dutch. On April 9, 1609, the 12 years' truce was signed, marking the end, at least temporarily, of a war that had bled the land dry. Alongside the truce came another edict, a reform of the water laws. The harshest tolls were lifted. Public fountains were reopened. Local magistrates were empowered to manage water use independently of the crown. It was not a reversal, it was a recalibration. When the news reached Isabel's bedside, she did not protest. "Perhaps it is for the best," she whispered. "Water flows, as you said. It cannot be held forever." Her mind drifted between fever and clarity. She began dictating letters, to her brother Philip III, to her young nephew, the future Philip IV. They were not instructions, but reflections, not orders, but confessions. One afternoon, she turned to Doña Sancha as the bandages were changed and said, "The true power, I think, lies not in holding, but in yielding, in adapting, like the water I so feared." By June, her decline was unmistakable. Fully grown worms now emerged from her body in alarming numbers. They slid down her arms and across her sheets. Even the strongest perfumes failed to mask the stench. Priests came daily, the sacraments were administered, and yet her breath held. Her spirit, fierce, wounded, and burning, clung to life. In desperation, Van Helmont proposed one final act, a full bath, not a cleansing, a rite. Water infused with rosemary, thyme, and lavender, herbs of the dead and the divine, would be heated in great copper basins and poured into a tub carved of white marble. The room was prepared with solemn reverence, as if for baptism or burial. When she was lowered into the bath, her cry echoed through the palace. It was not pain, it was release. Hundreds of worms fled her flesh at once, writhing into the reddened water. Her hands gripped the tub's edges, her eyes fluttered shut, and for a moment, just a moment, her face was serene. That night, Isabel Clara Eugenia, the woman who had tried to conquer rivers and command rainfall, died. Her hand in Albert's, her body clean, her spirit, perhaps, finally at peace. The bells of Brussels tolled for 3 days, not just for an archduchess, but for the end of a reign defined by control and the beginning of something else. But her story had only begun. 12 years had passed since the death of Isabel Clara Eugenia. Brussels had changed. The canals that once stood under lock and levee now flowed freely through the city, their waters glittering with the reflection of a more peaceful era. Public fountains ran again, no longer monuments to defiance, but gathering places, where women scrubbed linens, children splashed barefoot, and merchants filled their barrels without fear of tolls or permits. From a high window in the Coudenberg Palace, Archduke Albert watched the anniversary preparations unfold below. He was older now, gray streaking his beard, his frame thinner, his eyes heavier. The court bustled around him, arranging a solemn ceremony to honor his late wife. Time had worn down the rawness of her legacy, sanding her memory into something smoother, if not yet fully soft. What had once been fear, even hatred, was now tempered with something else: curiosity, nuance. Albert had rarely spoken of her publicly. In court, he honored her memory. In council, he defended her policies. But in private, he carried the weight of contradictions. A ruler who had loved a woman made of stone and flame and had watched her burn herself from the inside out. The chamberlain's voice stirred him from his reverie. "Your Highness, the envoys from Madrid have arrived." Among them was a young cleric, Balthazar Zuniga, nephew of the powerful Count Duke of Olivares. He bore letters from the Spanish crown to discuss the upcoming expiration of the 12 years' truce. But he carried something else, too, a question, a fascination. "I must confess, Your Highness," Zuniga said after the formalities, "I have long studied the governance of the Spanish Netherlands, and I'm particularly interested in Her Excellency's water policies." Albert did not respond immediately, but that evening he sent for the young man. They sat in the Archduke's private library, firelight flickering across shelves of leather-bound volumes and aging scrolls. "What I am about to tell you," Albert began, pouring them both glasses of wine, "does not appear in any official record." And he spoke, not like a ruler, not even like a widower, but like a man haunted by a memory he could not quite hold or release. He told Zuniga of Isabel's rise, her fierce belief in order, her obsession with control, her illness, the worms, the water. "But why?" Zuniga asked softly. "Would a woman educated in Europe's finest court, raised by kings and counseled by cardinals, grow to fear water?" Albert leaned back in his chair, eyes half-lidded in memory. "She grew up in El Escorial," he said, "a place of granite and silence. Her father believed frequent bathing to be a Moorish habit, dangerous, decadent, and unchristian. He distrusted water was the symbol of all that could not be grasped. It flowed. It resisted boundaries. It slipped through fingers and obeyed no structure. Isabel believed in power that stood still, immovable, absolute. But water? It shifts. It evades. It adapts." Zuniga nodded. "She tried to control not just the rivers, but the tides of history, of change." "Exactly," Albert said. The next day, Zuniga was taken to the Cathedral of St. Gudula. There, in a side chapel beneath carved archways, stood Isabel's tomb. Her effigy lay in repose, carved in white stone, her features serene at last. Above her head, added at Albert's command, was a curious detail, a small marble fountain, its spout forever pouring water into a basin below. A priest explained, "It represents the Empress's final reconciliation with what she feared most." Later that afternoon, Zuniga wandered the old city streets, the sky a soft slate gray overhead. At a recently restored public fountain, he saw an old woman filling her jug. Around her, a knot of children sat cross-legged, listening. "And so," the woman said, her voice lilting with drama, "the Empress Who Banned Water was consumed by worms. But when she finally bathed, oh, what a bath! The worms died, and her soul was saved." The children gasped. One clapped. Zuniga stepped forward, intrigued. "Is that how the story goes?" The woman eyed him shrewdly. "You're not from here, are you?" He shook his head. She grinned. "Every Fleming knows the tale of the Empress of the Worms. She tried to tax the rivers, they say, even poison the wells to make people obey. But God punished her, filled her body with squirming things until she learned to respect his gifts. She died clean. That's what matters." He listened for an hour as the tale twisted through myth and memory. In her version, Isabel wasn't just a ruler. She was a monster and a martyr, a warning and a miracle. It was history woven into legend. That evening, he recounted the story to Albert. "It hardly resembles the truth," Zuniga admitted, "but it captures something more." Albert gave a faint smile. "That," he said, "is how history becomes legend, and legend becomes myth. Facts erode, but meaning endures. What matters is the lesson." "And what is that lesson?" Zuniga asked. Albert looked out the window, where the last rays of dusk touched the waters of the canal below. "That to rule is not to force reality to obey you," he said. "It is to understand its currents, to move with them, not against them." Isabel had learned it too late, but perhaps the land she tried to rule had not. Before leaving Brussels for Madrid, Baltasar Zuniga was granted special access to Isabel Clara Eugenia's private journals, volumes long locked away, guarded by the Spanish court as both relic and embarrassment. The final entries: "Is it not the perfect metaphor? The water I feared is now my only relief. Perhaps I have been fighting the one force that could have saved me in these lands. Control has turned upon me, as the worms that grew from my own sick flesh. Jim 1st, 1609. I dream of clear water. I do not fear it. I understand now. It does not destroy. It transforms. All that we are, all we build, will one day be carried away in its current. Wisdom lies not in resisting this, but in learning to ride its flow. If I could begin again." The entry ended abruptly. Days later, she died. Back in Madrid, Zuniga began compiling his history of the Archduke's rule. He did not portray Isabel as a tyrant, nor did he canonize her as a misunderstood saint. Instead, he wrote of a woman caught between centuries, born of absolutism, drowned in change. A monarch who believed too much in permanence and learned too late that nothing endures, not kingdoms, not edicts, not even flesh. In Brussels, Albert lived out his final years in quiet stewardship. With the truce in place and his wife's legacy settled into the soil of public memory, he focused on the future. Under his guidance, a new model of water management emerged, less rigid, more responsive. A network of sluices, canals, and public fountains balanced flood control with free access. Other European cities soon copied the model. It would become one of the Archduke's most enduring contributions to statecraft. When Albert died in 1621, he was buried beside Isabel in the Cathedral of St. Gudula. Their tomb bore no portraits, no gilded relics, just a Latin inscription carved in simple stone. Aqua vita, aqua sapientia. Water is life, water is wisdom. In the years that followed, Isabel's story split into many shapes. In Flanders taverns, she became the Empress of the Worms, a grotesque cautionary tale whispered over mugs of ale, a warning about rulers who tried to outmatch nature. In Spain, she was remembered more nobly, the pious Infanta who had sacrificed everything to preserve the Catholic faith in rebellious lands. Historians unearthed Van Helmont's original medical report, revealing the grim truth. The infestation had begun with small scratches, likely from dermatitis, worsened by mercury-based cosmetics and a lack of basic hygiene. Science confirmed the irony. She had been undone by the absence of what she had forbidden. Yet the truth did little to kill the myth. During the Enlightenment, philosophers cited her tale as a parable of absolutism clashing with natural law. Belgian nationalists later reframed her as the ultimate symbol of foreign oppression, a Habsburg despot who tried to strangle Flemish freedom with rules and rot. Romantic painters turned her death into high Gothic art, candles guttering in shadowed cathedrals, worms crawling over velvet skin. Feminist scholars questioned the narrative entirely. How much had misogyny twisted her memory into horror? #meta, pause, usex 0.05. By the time 2009 arrived, 4 centuries since her death, an international symposium gathered in Brussels to assess her legacy. Historians, theologians, scientists, artists. The conclusion was unanimous. Her legend had transcended fact. She had become something else, a cultural myth, a vessel for meaning, a warning, a metaphor, a mirror. Today, few in Brussels know the full chronology of her reign. The dates have faded, but the story lingers, in idioms, in rituals, in laughter. To say someone has the Empress's worms is to say they are suffering from their own stubbornness. To forbid water is to attempt the impossible. Each year in June, the anniversary of her death is marked by a water festival. Families gather in the Grand Place, and at dusk, a theatrical reenactment is performed. Children dressed in velvet gowns parade through the square, and at the climax, an actress playing the Empress steps into a fountain and lets the water pour over her, her crown slipping off, her arms lifted in surrender. A modern sculpture stands nearby, a fountain encircled by iron reeds, each inscribed with lines from her final journal. At its base are the words, "Water, like life, cannot be contained, only guided." Tourists toss coins into the basin without knowing they are continuing the ritual, a centuries-old echo of a woman who tried to rule the unrulable. And so, the story runs on, like water.